Liberal nationalism is the key to securing rights. So there's a concept I've been tossing around that I didn't realize had its own name. Uh, I don't see it come up very often, and when I was generally trying to do a kind of a reverse search on a definition, I ended up coming up with an Encyclopedia Britannica article talking about liberal nationalism. And so that's going to be the crux of what we're talking about here. And I believe in terms of if you expect to be a nation that has expanding rights, or at least maintaining rights that aren't losing ground, a functional nation, a large, strong nation, and a nation that practices nationalism have to be key components. Now, nationalism gets a bad rap because there have been some horrendous failures under the banner of some forms of nationalism. But the key part of understanding this is there are different forms of nationalism. And the form we want to strive for is liberal nationalism. Prior to the 1600s, nationalism didn't really exist. In ancient times, civilization and unity rested on the concept of culture. The culture of the ancient Greeks was a juggernaut, binding many ethnicities, languages, and government types under one rough common cause. Becoming Hellenized under Greek culture didn't guarantee all the rights of the freest group in the Greek sphere, but it did tend to improve things for the people in its reach. The Roman state was a cultural phenomenon as well, one of them that had been partially subjugated by Greek culture, while at the same time conquering the lands of the Greeks. When ancient civilizations didn't rest on culture, they often revolved around the dynasties of their leadership or their establishment. The first form of modern nationalism to arise was that of England in the 1600s. Most of our critical natural rights became fixed in the minds of English at this point. Yes, we view these rights as natural or God-given or perhaps even human rights. However, the English of this era would never have said my God-given rights as a human. They would say my God-given rights as an Englishman. This was an important and unique fusion of concepts: nation, people, rights, and form of government. This was liberal nationalism. The system recognized the rights of individuals as part of its reason for existence. The result was undeniable: a people with a stable system of rights. To a greater extent than any other colonial power, the English system tended to leave behind an apparatus that left its post-colonial nations better off than those of other colonial empires. And as most of you who know me, I'm no Anglophile. The English nationalism did have a negative component to it. This form of nationalism was partially bonded with Calvinist thought, and this would create a systemic desire to proselytize their system to the world. As such, it became an aggressive form of nationalism, comparatively benevolent to its people, yet at the same time determined to spread Englishness to the world. Peaceful aliens tended to be allowed similar rights as an Englishman. People from English colonies could be granted citizenship via court proceedings. Regardless, the US and English-speaking former colonies are all the better for it. The other English colonies are better off than the former colonies of other powers. The next nationalist nation was the US. The thinkers of both the Revolution and the Constitution were steeped in the writings and thoughts of the same governmental theorists of England. It's only natural that a similar form of nationalism arose. He became a major defender of the U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation. The so-called anti-federalists who backed this system would have more properly been called anti-nationalist. The Federalists were more aptly nationalists. Although the Nationalists, Federalists, were not big fans of the Bill of Rights, the nationalist structure would equalize some of the lagging states in terms of parity of rights. It would lay the legal groundwork for the emancipation of slaves. The French nationalism that would come out was a byproduct of their revolution. Initially, French nationalism was adopting the tenets of liberal nationalism. Then, without warning, French nationalism became a proselytizing nationalism, where it was believed that the revolution needed to sweep all of Europe. The French Revolution had issues in terms of that because the church was part of its power structure, and the revolution had to excise the church as well. With no moral grounding, the French Revolution disintegrated into a bloodbath. But even then, once Napoleon took over, many of the nations that France defeated were improved. The Napoleonic Code tended to be an improvement on the old local imperial codes. Most of the rights that Englishmen and Americans held were adopted as part of this code. The system's name would change when Napoleon was finally deposed, but would remain intact after the fall of Napoleon. The French would end up partially abolishing slavery in all but the sugarcane producing colonies, and later Napoleon would ban the slave trade altogether. Slavery would eventually end by the mid-1800s. Now, progressives and Marxists try to call the American and British acceptance of slavery and forced assimilation of native people a byproduct of nationalism. The two great sins of America and Britain can't be blamed on nationalism. Slavery predates nationalism by pretty much as long as any kind of civilization ever exists. And conversely, that same slavery that predates nationalism only started getting rolled back in the nationalist states first. The English were one of the first nations to actively move away from and disrupt slavery. They worked to shut down the Atlantic slave trade, even though it wasn't economically beneficial to do so. The American system essentially put slavery into a long-term death spiral. Our federal system couldn't outlaw it overnight, but a trend towards the extinction of the institution seemed inevitable. The Civil War merely ended suddenly what would have probably ended decades later down the road. The wars against the tribal Americans also predates nationalism. There were attempts, both benevolent and by force, to have Indians culturally assimilate into both pre-U.S. colonies as well as afterwards. The impulse would seem to be far more cultural than nationalist in nature. The U.S. mostly succeeded from being contaminated by the urge to proselytize up through the Civil War. The Civil War birthed the American progressive movement. The progressives were never happy with just meddling at home. They were driven by their ideology to put Americanism on a world tour. The progressive urge to impose social order mimics the English Calvinism that spawned the British Empire. If we look at the places where other forms of nationalism occurred, we don't see the same progression of rights. Unless, of course, you think government taking stuff from one group of people and giving it to another is a right. But that's another video. At issue were the other forms of nationalism. All are illiberal in nature. The term that would best describe most of these bad forms of nationalism would be ethno-nationalism. Ethno-nationalism works best where the makeup of the internal ethnicities is only separated by dialect. For example, in France, the different regions of France weren't considered really a united ethnicity until nationalism made it so. Nationalism isn't always a uniting feature, though. For example, nationalism broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire began its breakup with the rise of Turkish ethno-nationalism. Russian ethno-nationalism was more insidious and methodical, where all conquest went through a process of Russification, something that continued to occur but was hidden by the Soviet Union. So the process of Russifying conquered areas didn't stop uh, with the rise of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and all the other isms that come through that. That process of Russification continues to this day, and we can see the expansionist nature of the ethno-nationalist state in action in our current events. Italy's fascism was a merger of socialism and nationalism. First, the goal was to unite a country that had been a collection of a dozen nations only 70 years earlier. It was also an attempt to displace Marxian net socialism with a form of socialism that was more acceptable uh, to the ruling class of Italy at the time. Germany was odd in the fact that German people were split between Austria, Prussia, and some 450 different ethnic German states. A combination of Napoleonic merging of some of these states and the rise of the mythic Volk movement set the stage for National Socialism. This was a merging of Aryan race theory, which transcended borders with a quasi-religious form of socialism. Clearly, we can see that the British, the US, and to a lesser extent France advanced human rights at home and in their spheres of influence. This was at a time when the countries were clearly nationalistic. Other nationalistic countries like Russia, Germany, and Italy were revolutionary in the nature of socialism, yet very regressive in the terms of human rights. The hope of the left drifted into globalism. They wrongly assumed only bad could come from nationalism. They sought to create extranational governance like the UN and EU. But really, the history of these organizations are a history of lots of slogans, lots of uh, talk that sounds like benevolence and progress, but in fact, the history of these organizations show that they are socialistic and illiberal. Rights have not been advancing under these organizations, they've been actually falling back. The only thing they seem to be able to advance is bureaucracy independence. Since liberal nationalism has a track record of achievement in terms of rights, logically, we should be looking to form a new nationalism. This new nationalism should be a liberal nationalism, stripped of pseudo Calvinistic urges and avoiding arrogant expansionist progressivism. Its goal should be to create an example to the world, not a state that attempts to push itself beyond its borders. I think this is very possible, but it requires the careful philosophical thought to see what should and should not be part of nationalism. So, comment below. Have you heard of liberal nationalism before? Do you have an opinion on it? Do you think the idea of nationalism versus globalism is part of a valid argument that's being had out there? Or is globalism pretty much going to end up winning the day? Or in other words, is the argument already over? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not one of my regular subscribers, please consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please consider sharing it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.